I kept comparing him to my ex without realizing it was hurting him. He left and now I regret it. Hello, my name is Michelle. I'm 29 and I'm a flight attendant. So I get to travel a lot and meet many people. This is my first time here. And funny enough, I'm not here to read stories or anything, but to write mine. I'm looking for advice. My fiancé left me and I'm really upset and confused about what I can do to get our relationship back because I love him. I kept comparing him to my ex, which I now realize hurt him. He left and I regret it a lot. I'm not to blame just yet. I honestly didn't know that. He felt that way because he never said so. He did say it several times, but I just wasn't listening. I thought it was a normal thing to talk about my past. Let me tell you what happened. Daniel, my fiancé, was a very handsome guy. We grew up together and didn't become lovers until we were out of college. We did everything. We were practically inseparable when we were younger. I was usually at Daniel's place because I grew up in a pretty dysfunctional home. So it was a kind of safe zone for me whenever I had to escape my own home. I never knew my father because my mom said he wasn't worth anything. My mom never wanted to talk about my dad. When I asked her about him, she would get angry and start saying that she did everything for me and that I shouldn't lose her as a mother by trying to find out more about my dad. I eventually stopped asking. When people ask me about my father, I just tell them he died before I even got to know him. My mother got married 3 times and I was the bridesmaid each time. It was really tough to watch her marry someone new who was just after her money. She always ended up heartbroken. Time was also a factor because each marriage ended badly. It seemed like each man had the same goal, exploiting her and cheating on her with younger women. She never seemed to learn her lesson because she kept ending up in the same situations. When I tried to voice my concern, she'd tell me, "Michelle, I swore it would be different this time," but it ended up being the same situation she'd supposedly avoided. I couldn't bear living with her again after she got married to the 4th man. I wanted to leave as soon as I could, and I was so desperate that I left as soon as I could. I was told about my mother's accident, which killed her and her new partner when I left home. I didn't keep track of how many partners she had, so I don't know how many there were. Maybe because I was thinking about leaving home, I developed a love for being a flight attendant. I didn't have to go to college to become one, so I was happy. Daniel was the smart one. I started developing my skills, learning different languages, and giving first aid, among other things. I did everything I could to pass the recruitment process so I could leave. I was able to leave the recruitment process early, and I was lucky enough to become a flight attendant at the age of 21. I left before Daniel and eventually moved to another city far away to avoid my mother and her constant wedding plans. We lost contact after I moved because of my job, but I was able to travel a lot and meet different people. I met lots of different people, so my first boyfriend was black. Jason was a very sweet person. He traveled with our airline and took a first-class flight. For those of you who don't know, there are different classes of travel with different airlines, depending on how much you pay. First class is the most luxurious and highest level of service offered by airlines. It provides an unparalleled level of luxury and personalized attention. Jason traveled in first class, and I was the one who attended to him. I was all smiles and ready to serve. Jason had charmed me with his sophistication. Despite the fact that I was only a flight attendant, Jason treated me with the utmost respect. We weren't permitted to share our private contact information with customers, so I couldn't give Jason mine. Jason, in his romantic delusions, had said that if fate wanted us to be together, it would happen. We agreed to meet again, this time outside of work, so I could finally give him the contact details he needed. I smiled, but in my mind I was hoping we would meet again. I know it sounds crazy, but we did meet, and luckily, it was outside of work. I was on a break that day, and my friend Molly, who worked as a manager on a SOAR. At a company, I was invited out for lunch, and I agreed. The plan was that we were going to meet at her workplace, and then together we were going to go hunting for a restaurant to fill our empty stomachs. Mine was empty because I had only had cereal that morning and was too lazy to cook. Hers was probably because I had to get to work early. Jason had somehow been in the building. When I stepped off the elevator, I stepped right into him because I had been talking to Molly, asking for directions. I had been distracted, so I was utterly surprised to see him. He was pleased to see me and finally got my contact info. I gave him some information and a promise to have dinner soon. I was excited and happy about it. When I asked Molly about Jason, she told me he was the CEO's son, and he was very rich too. Jason and I started exchanging texts and calls. Sometimes we would even meet up for dinner or lunch, depending on how busy we were. Sometimes Jason would surprise me with breakfast when he knew I had to leave early for work. He was just the sweetest person. He was the perfect guy, and I did not see us not ending up together in the end. I was so in love with Jason, and he loved me too. We dated for 6 months until, shockingly, Jason's engagement was announced. I was really upset and cried for several days, because Jason never told me anything about it. Jason tried to see me and texted me several times, but I wouldn't answer him. When I eventually did, he told me his parents had set up the match, and that he knew nothing about it. Unfortunately, he couldn't do anything about it. He told me that his company needed to merge with another company, so he had no choice but to get married. I didn't understand most of what he said, but that part really shocked me. What shocked me even more was when Jason told me that it didn't stop us. He said we could still be together, but I wasn't happy about that. I loved him, but I didn't want to be in the middle of a married couple. I knew what my mother's cheating partners did to her. I'd heard her crying across the room many nights when she thought I was asleep. I was tempted, I have to admit. This made me realize that Jason loved me enough to still want to be with me despite getting married. I understood why partners cheat, but I still couldn't do that to the lady, even though I didn't even know her. I wasn't religious, but I still didn't want that on my conscience, so I broke things off. I ended things with Jason and made sure I couldn't be contacted. I even moved from my old apartment while I was getting my life back on track. I met Mason. It seems like I had a thing for guys whose names ended with son. I met Mason at a restaurant he owned where I went to have dinner. I didn't feel like cooking that night, and I was thinking about Jason again, so I decided to treat myself to a meal at an expensive restaurant. Mason saw me when I was sitting there, waiting for my order while he was leaving the restaurant. He went to check on how things were going. He said he'd slipped back into the kitchen and asked what my order was. He prepared it himself. I, on the other hand, had enjoyed the meal so much that when I was done, I was served dessert courtesy of the chef because I'd enjoyed the meal. I was surprised, but went along with it. I also enjoyed the dessert, and when I was done, I was told it was already settled. I asked who was behind it, and that's when Mason showed himself and introduced himself to me. I asked why he had paid my bills when I obviously could, but he told me Keenan. He said he couldn't ignore being a handsome savior to the damsel. I told him I wasn't in distress and that I enjoyed our little banter. When it was time to leave, he asked to see me again, and I agreed. We started seeing each other often, mostly at his place, and he was always cooking me delicious delicacies. Mason spoiled me silly. While I was with him, I found that other restaurants' food tasted bland and unappealing, even my own cooking. I'll admit that cooking wasn't my forte, but I did still try. However, whenever I was with Mason, I didn't even have to try to be good. He treated me to the best cooking, and I was very happy with him. That's why things didn't Mason and I got on so well, because even though he knew what I did for a living and that I worked with lots of people, he was still a bit jealous at the start of our relationship. It was sweet, though, and I thought it would wear off as he got to know me better. My job, but Mason went overboard, almost getting me fired. I'd slept over at his place and had to leave early for a flight. I'd already told Mason that, and in fact, before we slept, I'd set my alarm so I wouldn't have to rush to work. But my alarm didn't even ring at all. I checked to see if I'd just woken up to the alarm, or maybe it had been missed, but I realized that it had been switched off. It was even Jonas's call that woke me up. Jonas and I worked together at the same airline, and he was also a good friend of mine. When Mason saw who was calling, he became very angry and said I was actually lying about work and that it was Jonas I was cheating on him with. I was very surprised, and I didn't even have time to react because I was very late. Thankfully, the flight had to be cancelled because the plane had some technical issues. There were some technical issues with the plane and other planes weren't available, but I was still scolded, and my boss said that next time I might not be that lucky. I went back home feeling angry at Mason, especially since he wasn't sorry at all after I texted him about the consequences of his actions. Instead, he replied with, "Thankfully, you didn't lose the job," and offered to cook me lunch. I wasn't happy about it, but I eventually let it go. It continued like that until I got tired of his tantrums and occasional mood swings whenever he saw me with any guy except himself. I had to eventually. It's time to move on from Jim. Our relationship lasted for 4 months, which is shorter than the one I have with Jason. I met Jim on a blind date set up by Molly. She made it clear that I had to go and that I should move on and meet someone because I wasn't going to get married. I had been moping about my exes and I should move on. Jim was a charming person and he worked as a tech guy. He worked remotely, so his work was mobile. He didn't talk much, but he usually communicated his feelings by buying me gifts. Sometimes it was a nice piece of clothing or he'd buy me nice things like earrings or a necklace. I didn't mind that he didn't talk much, though. I guess too much time on the computer and doing calculations did that to someone. I don't know. When I wanted to talk about work or life, he'd just listen. While he was typing away on his computer, he wasn't even listening to me. When I got angry, he'd buy me gifts and write me an apology note. I wanted him to say sorry to me and tell me nice things. We'd get over it. But that wasn't how it happened. I got used to his lack of communication. Verbal communication wasn't his strong point. Sometimes we barely spoke for 2 weeks. He'd just send me presents and I'd respond with a thank you text until the gifts reduced and eventually stopped. I found out that Jim had started to date someone else, but I wasn't upset because we didn't even have that connection, if I can call it that. After JY, I decided to stop dating for a while and just focus on work instead. So when I was called that my mom had an accident and died, I had no choice. I went back home since I was her only child. I took time off work and went back home. There were lots of memories, most of which I didn't want to remember. But memories don't care whether you want to remember them or not. They're just there. I arranged the whole burial by myself. I was just hoping the day came and went because I just wanted to forget I ever came home. The day of the burial came and people showed up and said a few good things about my mother, which I know they did because of me, not my mother. My mother wasn't what the town approved of. They'd always shown their displeasure, even when I was a kid. I learned to avoid them, especially their pity and gaze when my mother forgot to drop the house keys and I had to sit outside and wait for her to get back from her frolicking around town with one of her most recent lovers. The only escape I had was when Daniel was around. I was usually at his place for warmth and food and also friendship. So when I was done with the burial ceremony, I had to stay back and decide what to do with the house. I knew for sure I didn't even want to have any attachments to the town again since the only person that I had there was already gone. I had gone for a walk to clear my head that day and I was so lost in thought that when someone grabbed my hand, I had almost gone karate on the person. I was super happy to see Daniel. I gave him a big hug and didn't realize I was crying until he started patting my back. Seeing Daniel again made me realize I just lost the only family I had. Despite the fact she wasn't the best mother to me, I guess I still loved her. I didn't realize that until I saw Daniel. He seemed to bring out all the real emotions in me, even just by seeing him. When I was done crying, Daniel just took me home without saying anything. Eventually, things got a bit strange. We hadn't seen each other in 5 years, and when I saw Daniel, I just started crying on his shoulders. I tried to make conversation and eventually things eased up. We started updating each other on what had been going on for the past 5 years. I sold my mother's house within a week of staying there and had to leave because my leave from work was almost up. Daniel told me that he had come for the burial when he heard the news. I knew I'd be coming home, so Daniel came to see me and pay his respects. I left before he did, but I promised I'd visit him whenever I could. Daniel and I started talking again, and it was really nice. He'd call me most times we texted, and when we were less busy, we'd talk on video. I really enjoyed talking to Daniel. We used to only talk about things like this when we were younger. This time, we were more mature and we'd both gone through things. Daniel told me about his past relationships and how they ended. I also told him about my own experiences. Daniel encouraged me to keep my promise of visiting him, and I did. We went out together and had a great time. I started visiting him more often when I had the chance. He was also very welcoming, and I began to develop feelings for him that weren't just friendly. At first, I ignored it because I thought it was because we had just reconnected and were always talking or texting. However, the feelings grew very fast. After 6 months of getting to know Daniel again, I was head over heels in love with him. I could tell that he felt the same way, but he never said anything. He always skirted around the subject, which sometimes got on my nerves. We would go to his place, watch movies, and do all the romantic stuff couples do. I thought he'd just grab me and kiss me, but he'd excuse himself and do something irrelevant and then ruin the moment. Other times I'd try to steer the conversation to that end, but Daniel would just either say work came up or he had to go and end the conversation. I was really frustrated, so much that I eventually took the initiative. I had gone to his place again that day and intended on spending the night before going back home the next day. That day I had promised myself that I wasn't going to let him avoid that conversation again, so I set the mood and had his house keys with me. I'd even kept the fact that I was visiting a secret, and I'd gone to work knowing the time that he'd be back. I'd cooked his dinner and even set some scented candles on the table and dimmed the lights. I'd showered and dressed in my sexy lingerie, which I'd bought earlier that day. When Daniel was back from work, he was surprised to see me. When I moved towards him, he thought I was going to hug him, but instead I kissed him. Daniel was so surprised, but I just smiled and asked. I encouraged him to eat all through dinner. He just kept glancing across the table at me, and I was grinning because I knew what I wanted to do when we finished dinner. I told him I wanted to talk to him, and when he sat, I told him about my feelings. Daniel, the shy boy, stuttered while trying to tell me he felt the same way. I remember that night. I smiled, kissed him, and asked him to be my boyfriend, and he agreed. We had sex that night, but of course I initiated it, seeing that Daniel couldn't muster the fennel for. I had to ask for sex. We started dating, and Daniel clearly didn't know how to please a woman. I had to tell him to buy me gifts on special occasions or even randomly. Sometimes he'd call me to ask which gifts I'd prefer or like to have. He didn't surprise me with random dates like my exes did. He'd rather call me and inform me, sometimes days ahead, before coming to take me on a date. He had a schedule that he followed strictly. He didn't do anything surprising or random for me, and this made the relationship very boring for me. I loved Daniel very much, but I wanted more spontaneity. Daniel wasn't giving me that at all, so I started dropping hints about how he should treat a woman he loves. I'd send him videos that I saw online of surprises guys pulled on their women, but Daniel still didn't get the memo, which frustrated me. So whenever we were together, I'd start telling him stories of how my exes were with me, how spoiled I was from my last relationships, and how many gifts I remember. Sometimes Daniel would just keep quiet and listen to me tell stories of how rich they were. I even told him that he was the least wealthy of all the guys I've been with. I even showed him pictures of the dates I had with my previous boyfriends. Sometimes he'd walk away with some excuse about work. I never knew that it was hurting him. I told him that he wasn't up to the standard of my exes. There was one time I wore a dress, matching shoes, and a bag with diamond earrings. I bought it for myself with money from Jim. I wore it to a date with Daniel. He complimented me on how I looked. I told him it was a gift from my ex. I said that everything was worth more than even his car and house. I know now as I write this, how terrible it must have been for him to endure my storytelling. I feel so horrible about how poorly I treated Daniel. Daniel started, he bought me gifts, but when he did, I complained about how cheap they were. He eventually stopped, which made me angry at him. Daniel was a planner. He planned his year ahead, the things he wanted to achieve before the year ended, and so on. I saw that as a waste of time because I believe that life is spontaneous. I just wanted to be spontaneous with it. I just wanted to spend money without worrying about the next day. Daniel wasn't like that. He wanted to save up to buy a better apartment and a better car. I didn't understand then. I called him a weak man and a coward who was afraid to spend his own money. One time, I was sitting in my room scrolling through my pictures, and I came across one I took with Jason. I was on a cruise ship, having a great time. Jason had just called to ask if I was free that day. I had just finished work, so I said no. He sent a driver to pick me up. It had been my first time on a ship and I was so happy that I took a picture with Jason in the background for memories. I hadn't even posted the picture because I just wanted to keep it on my phone. I enjoyed the private moment alone. The picture brought sweet memories of Jason to me. I texted him a quick hi before I realized what I did. I had eventually unblocked him when I knew I had moved on from him. That was when I was dating Jim. So when I texted him, I was still trying to delete the message when his reply came in. I was kind of happy at the speed he replied to me. I felt special somehow. We started texting after that and we'd talk for long periods. He'd often tell me how unhappy he was in his marriage and how he wished we were still together. I felt special that after all that time had passed, he still felt the same way about me. He invited me out for lunch but I first refused. I later agreed though. Seeing Jason after so long brought back feelings that I didn't even know were still there. Lunch with him was pretty amazing. We started meeting often and I started having less time for Daniel. One time he texted me that he was at my place waiting for me. I was with Jason. I'd forgotten that day that Daniel was coming over. It brought back feelings I didn't even know were still there. Lunch with him was pretty amazing. As we dined at one of the most exquisite restaurants, we started meeting often and I started having less time for Daniel. One time he texted me that he was at my place waiting for me and I was with Jason. I had forgotten that day that Daniel was coming over. My mind was on Jason when he texted to say he plans that only needed me to be there. I left my house and went straight to where he'd asked me to meet. He took me to a museum and then to watch a football match. From there we went to his hotel where he stayed and had dinner. I told Daniel I'd had to cover for a colleague. The workers got sick so I had to step in and Daniel had to head back home that evening. I felt guilty but I was so caught up with Jason that I just didn't want to stop. Jason and I started having sex again even though he was married and I was in a relationship with Daniel. We were just playing with each other. There were no strings attached. He spent money on me and he got sex in return. I was really happy to be able to spend money again without restrictions. I even stopped nagging Daniel and asking him for money. I loved him very much but I just couldn't help myself from cheating on him with Jason because of the luxurious life I got to live when my relationship was 2 years old. Daniel asked me to be his wife, which shocked me because it wasn't something I expected. Not that I didn't want it, but it wasn't something I nagged Daniel about. I didn't expect it but I didn't mind. Daniel came to my workplace when I just got back from a flight. He asked about my work and when I was finishing up that day I told him the truth because Jason was out of the country with his wife for work so I didn't have to lie. I thought he was just asking because he wanted to know but I was wrong. I was just getting off the plane and was still a bit distracted especially when I heard people screaming in the airport. It wasn't until I was down completely that I saw Daniel on one knee holding a ring and a card that read, "Will you marry me?" I was so shocked and excited that I said yes. The applause, whistling and congratulations were deafening as customers, people who had come to meet their loved ones and my colleagues. All the workers were there and I was really happy and pleased when Daniel took me home. That happiness didn't last long though. I was living on borrowed time because the very day I got engaged was the same day Daniel left me. This happened when I went to my room to take a bath and change into my pajamas while Daniel ordered our food on my phone. I told him to order from my phone because I had a particular restaurant that I always ordered from and because they were efficient and quick, so I told him to just use my phone to place the order while I took my bath. After I finished bathing and was putting on my pajamas, I heard the door bang shut and I thought it was Daniel collecting the food we ordered. I went into the kitchen expecting to smell food and see Daniel. Instead, I smelled nothing and couldn't find him anywhere. I checked the other rooms, the garage, but he was nowhere to be found. I was surprised because Daniel hadn't told me he was leaving. When I heard the doorbell, I quickly checked if it was Daniel, but it was just the delivery man. I became worried and took my phone to try calling him, but what I saw made me, I was really shocked. My phone was unlocked and all the messages I'd had with Jason were visible. Some of the messages were quite explicit. Jason had even sent a video of my proposal. He'd asked what would happen to us if I got married to Daniel. Daniel had seen the messages. I was really scared and started to call Daniel, but he wasn't picking up his calls or replying to any of my texts. I was very worried and couldn't even sleep throughout the night. The food Daniel had ordered for us was still where I left it because I lost my appetite. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't sure what to tell Daniel or what excuse I was going to make the next day. I asked a colleague to cover for me and she thought I was going to spend more time with my fiancé. I let her think I'd gone to Daniel's place, but he'd already left. I had a spare key, so I let myself in and waited for Daniel to come back. When he did, his face hardened and he looked angry. That was the first time I'd ever seen Daniel angry. He'd always been cool. He was independent and kept to himself, but I guess I rubbed him the wrong way. I tried to explain and apologize for everything, but Daniel said the whole engagement and the relationship were over because he'd always been the fourth man in my life. I always had to compare him to my exes and eventually ended up cheating on him with one. I cried and pleaded with Daniel, but he was set on ending things. I went back home feeling dejected and heartbroken. I ruined everything, so I'm here now desperately seeking help. I know what I did was terrible and I'm aware that other adjectives could be used to describe it. However, I'm seeking advice on how to win back my man. I'd really like to know if there's any way I can get Daniel to forgive me. I'm desperate to get him back. He's the only person I can think of who'd want to be with me, and I don't know what I'd do without him. It affects everything I do now. I messed up my life. I know that, and every day is a reminder of what I could have had and lost. Daniel is the best person I could ever have had around me, but I lost him because I was foolish and wanted too much. I'm alone in this world. I have nobody to tell my story to. I just wanted to talk about how I was feeling, but I got nothing but abuse and slander. It made me feel even worse about myself. I broke things off with Jason, who was the reason I lost Daniel. I heard that Jason had other lovers too. My wife found out and is filing for a divorce and a huge alimony as well as transfer of ownership of the company since her family had the larger share. It's as bad for him as it is for me. I've been placed on suspension because I started concentrating less and shouted at not one but 3 customers while at work. It's not even been decided what to do with me yet, but I already know that it probably won't be good. It's not going to be good. 2 of the people I argued with are some of our best customers. I feel ashamed for ever comparing Daniel with any of my exes. After the breakup, I see things very clearly. I know now sadly that they weren't half the man that Daniel is. Daniel was my confidant, my best friend and my lover. I lost everything. I've tried to apologize to Daniel many times by calling and texting him, but he never responds. I've sent hundreds of messages telling him how sorry I am and how much I regret losing what we had together. He reads them but never replies. I can't forgive myself for what I did to hurt him. My job is on shaky ground and my relationship is over. I'm at a loss. I have no one to talk to except on this app where all I get are more regrets. I stare at my ceiling for hours thinking about how my actions are affecting my life. I think about how things could have been different if I hadn't compared Daniel with my exes and if I hadn't cheated on him with one of them.